Hi, this is Andrew from Unitarian Apologetics. Welcome to this very special presentation on the problems with the Trinity. Now, this is not just my personal ideological problem with the Trinity. This is not me saying, well, it's impossible for God to become a man. This is just a video showing that either the doctrine of the Trinity is just unable to be verified logically, or it is tritheism. And we're going to get into that all through the presentation. But at the heart of this video presentation is just what the problem with the doctrine of the Trinity is. Now, the first problem with the doctrine of the Trinity is that there is no the doctrine of the Trinity. When Trinitarians use this phrase, the doctrine of the Trinity, it gives the impression that there is a single, unified, agreed upon doctrine. And this is just historically and demonstrably false. Not only has the doctrine of the Trinity developed over many hundreds of years, but also when we get into modern, what I'll call modern Trinitarianism or social Trinitarianism, they're also at odds with historical Trinitarianism. And so there's a lot of different explanations, and a lot of them are contradictory to each other and would be deemed heretical by each other. So there is no the doctrine of the Trinity. All right, problem number two with the doctrine of the Trinity is that for the Trinitarian, the Trinity has to be true no matter how it's explained, often or always for ideological reasons. And so at the root of all of this, before we begin to interpret or even talk about the Trinity, for the Trinitarian, the Trinity just has to be true. And I'll give an example. So an ideological reason would be something like Jesus has to be God in order to atone for sin. Trinitarians' ideological sentiment they might have would also be something like Jesus had to be God in order to live a sinless life. And probably at the root of all of these things is the Trinitarians believe that you must believe that Jesus is God and that he died for you and things like this in order to obtain salvation after death or eternal life with God. And so we must understand the difference between an ideological argument and an exegetical one. So we can define an ideological argument as an argument driven by emotional attachment, tradition, or personal preference rather than objective reasoning or textual evidence. Again, an example of this would be Jesus must be God in order to atone for sin. This is just something that is not explicitly stated in the Bible, and this is just an ideological sentiment that the Trinitarian has before they even begin to interpret or attempt to exegete the Bible. And again, so where does it say this in the Bible? Where do you see in the Bible that it says Jesus must be God in order to atone for sin? This is just more of an ideology that the Trinitarian has, more than something that they have extracted from the Bible. And we'll get into all of that as well. While an exegetical argument would be, we could define as an argument derived from careful interpretation of Scripture based on linguistic, historical, and contextual analysis. So where the ideological position says Jesus must be God in order to atone for sin, the exegetical position says, let's let the Bible define how atonement works and what is required to obtain it. Now, I constructed this simple model to show the circular reasoning of the Trinitarian. This is what I would call the common Trinitarian reasoning model. Now, also, so the common Trinitarians, I would say, tend to focus more on the Bible and use the Bible to argue more than philosophy. And we'll see in a second that there are other types of Trinitarians who could be called analytic Trinitarians, who would construct various philosophical models, and they tend to focus more on philosophy rather than the Bible. Okay, so starting at the top, again, for the Trinitarian, They begin with this ideological sentiment or tradition and say that the Trinity must be true. For them, the Trinity must be true no matter what. And so moving down the model, then they'll interpret scripture to fit the Trinity. They find there's a lot of confirmation bias going on. They sort of, anything that they read in the Bible, it has to fit the Trinity because the Trinity must be true. And that's the foundational premise in their reasoning. Any contradictions that come up, they just dismiss the contradictions as a mystery. That's the next step. And so, or they'll say things like, well, you're just using your human reasoning. We can't really fully understand this. It's a mystery. Then they'll appeal to church tradition or authority, believing that they find some solace there. But we're going to find out that they actually don't. Modern Trinitarians don't, anyways. And so this just reinforces their original ideological view, and then the circle just continues. Now, you do have Trinitarians, these new wave of analytic Trinitarians who are called often social Trinitarians as well. And these tend to be more philosophically minded Trinitarians, and they won't allow there to be these contradictions and just written off as a mystery. And so this is how they operate. That's what I would call the circular logic of analytic Trinitarianism. Again, they tend to focus more on philosophy and tend to be rather weak in exegeting the Bible or finding their doctrine in the Bible. Okay, and so again, though, they start also from the ideological sentiment that the Trinity must be true, but they instead of trying to sort of impose the doctrine of Trinity to fit the scriptures, which they do as well. But what they've done is constructed a philosophical model to explain it. And so instead of just writing it off as a mystery, they tend to construct philosophical models to explain it. Then what they do, and this is something we'll get into in just a little bit, is they'll redefine terms to fit the model. And so ordinary terms, I guess, like person and will, and but other terms like being and person, they'll just sort of redefine what they mean in order to fit the model. And then when they get challenged on what those things mean, they shift into a more complex model. Okay, and then they make it so hard to follow in their mind, but it reinforces their original ideological view. Because again, for both forms of Trinitarianism, the Trinity must be true. That's the premise they start with. And so all of their reasoning is circular in nature. And so this is something I want to focus on here, because this is the next problem with the Trinity, is that they'll redefine terms to fit the model. So problem number 3 is that rarely are terms defined. We see the Trinitarians using various terms like being, persons, things like this, but rarely do they define precisely what they mean. Okay, so we see words being, persons, hypostasis, self, divine, deity, God, things like this, but rarely do they define exactly what they mean by that. So it's difficult, if not impossible, to verify these things logically, because there's a lot of conceptual vagueness around these terms. And so we sort of see within both models, they tend to agree on a basic definition that God is one being in 3 divine persons. So I think the terms being and persons should be defined. Being we'll see, is a little bit easier to define, even though the Trinitarian will not often define it for you, or they'll leave it sort of vague in their mind in presentation. But I'll define a being as a particular type of existence that possesses distinct essential qualities, properties, and characteristics, which is its underlying identity that determines how it exists and operates. And so a being is known by its qualities, So you would look at a being and you would see, well, what type of being does this person or thing have? And you'll know that by its qualities, properties, and characteristics, and this determines how it exists and operates. But what's not so clear, and what we're going to see, the sort of heart of the matter of all vagueness and elusiveness of the Trinity, really, I would argue, centers around the term person and how we define person. Now, we would think that, a person is a person. We could say, well, this is an individual with their own will, and somebody who has distinct characteristics and things like this, and is an individual. But we'll see that's not exactly the case in all forms of Trinitarianism. So again, I would define a person, and you would think that a person could be defined as an individually willed being possessing self-awareness, rationality, and the capacity for intentional actions. But not so fast, because if you say that a person is individually willed, this seems to imply that there are three wills, and this doesn't work with all forms of the Trinity. So the only way that individually willed works is for modern Trinitarianism, who argue that God is essentially a community of persons who can interact with each other and who each have their own individual will. So we see in social Trinitarianism, or what I would call is modern Trinitarianism, there's three wills, and there's essentially a divine community of three individually willed persons. But when it comes to classic Trinitarianism, what some would call orthodox Trinitarianism, we don't really know, because they'll argue that there's just one will. And so it sort of begs the question, how can a person be truly a person without possessing their own distinct will and volition? So you could say within social and modern Trinitarianism, which classic Trinitarianism would probably say is heretical, or tritheism, which is probably correct, but social Trinitarianism teaches that essentially there's this divine community and that each person has their own will. But classic Trinitarianism directly opposes this idea. And so it becomes difficult, but I think the heart of the matter becomes the conceptual vagueness of the word person within so-called classic Trinitarianism. And so here's the problem. How can a person be truly a person without possessing their own distinct will and volition? So the volition would be essentially the ability to exercise their own will, having an autonomous will. So, and then again, it can be posed like this. If each divine person of the Trinity is fully and truly a person, how can they lack individual will and volition? And so there is a conceptual vagueness here from classic Trinitarianism. And this is really the heart of the matter, is that they're using the word person in a secondary or abstract sense. And so they don't mean person in the sense like we would think a person is an individual capable of exercising their own will or having an autonomous will. No. For the classic Trinitarians, they're using person in some sort of secondary sense. And this is why you hear the argument, well, Andrew, it originally started from this word hypostasis, and you see, you're just not really understanding how person is being used, and you don't really understand Orthodox Trinitarianism. Well, until we are presented with a proposition, we cannot verify whether it's true or not. So they'll say, well, there's one God and he's three persons, but then they'll fail to define person. And I haven't heard to this day a Trinitarian who claims to be a classic Trinitarian really define exactly what a person is. But these modern Trinitarians hear the word person, and obviously they think of it in a usual or common sense that a person is an individually willed person. And so what the problem is classic Trinitarians are using the word person in a secondary sense. When they say person, they don't mean a person that has their own individual will. which just begs the question, what do they mean by person? Okay, again, we would define a person as an individually willed being possessing self-awareness, rationality, and the capacity for intentional action. And since these so-called classic or historic Trinitarians won't give a definition for person, it cannot be verified by propositional logic, and therefore it can't be proven to be a rational option, which leads them to dismiss it as a mystery, but it's not coherent. So you can't verify it by logic because there's conceptual vagueness around that word person. But social Trinitarians are using the word person in a common or modern sense to mean three individually willed autonomous persons within the divine community. So the problem with this is that if there's three equal true persons, then there's three equal beings, and that's tritheism. Now they'll try to get away with saying, no, Andrew, you don't understand. There's only one being and there's three persons, because they're taking the word being from classic Trinitarianism and attempting to adopt it while redefining what person means. But the original problem that the classic Trinitarians had is to say that if you did have three individually willed persons, you would be a tritheist, because each person is its own being if they're truly independently, autonomously willed. Okay, and so again, we have this clash, and really is that these classic so-called Orthodox Trinitarians are really at odds with modern social Trinitarians. And so this is something that they really need to hash out between themselves. But I'll give the problem with both of them is that the classic Trinitarianism can't be proven logically due to the conceptual vagueness of the word person. They fail to define person. And so if each person doesn't have their own autonomous will, what they're saying is that the Father does not have his own autonomous will. And this just completely contradicts the entire Bible. To say that God, the Father, does not have his own autonomous will completely contradicts the Bible. Instead, they say somehow that the one being shares a will. They share a will, but they're not able to act autonomously. Okay? It just logically doesn't follow. And so they use this word person, and you can't verify something if it has conceptual vagueness. Okay, but the social Trinitarians, who I would say are modern Trinitarians, have no orthodox leg to stand on because they're at odds with classical Trinitarianism. But they understand that the word person means an individually willed, rational person, an individual who's capable of making their own decisions and exercising their own will. And really at the heart of everything, one of the biggest problems, and really if we want to cut to the core as a Unitarian, when it cuts to the core of the whole conversation, is simply that there's nowhere in the Bible where Jesus has the qualities necessary to be truly God. Again, here we would define God as being supremely intelligent, supremely powerful, who created all things and whose will is sovereign over all beings. I think this is a solid definition of what God is, or the characteristics or what the being of God is, and that we just simply don't see that concerning Jesus in the New Testament. And so these are the qualities which define God's being. So this is how God exists and how he's able to operate in a simple way. Of course, there's more to God's being than just this, but I think these are qualities that a being must possess in order to be truly called God. And we see none of these things that Jesus has. Jesus didn't create anything in the universe. His will is not sovereign over anyone's. The Father's will is sovereign over even Jesus's will. Jesus is not supremely powerful or equally supremely powerful. Just the Father alone is. And Jesus is also not supremely intelligent like the Father. And so the heart of the matter is that Jesus just simply doesn't possess the qualities necessary to be qualified as God. And so the answer to everything, of course, is that only the Father alone possesses all of the attributes necessary to be God. And so when we define person, here's this autonomous person. He's obviously has his own will and the ability to exercise his will. So he is an autonomously willed person. And so this seems to contradict classic Orthodox, so-called Orthodox Trinitarianism, which says that all of the three persons share a will together, and that the Father is not an autonomously willed person by himself. And so, but where you have modern or social Trinitarians, they say that they understand the word person and say that they do have their own individual will. Now, this creates all sort of logical problems and exegetical problems, but one of the main problems is the reason that classic or Orthodox Trinitarianism rejects social Trinitarianism is because even they understand that it's tritheism. Okay, so this, I think, will have to be part of a series of videos, because there's a lot of things we could get into. We could talk about the historical development of persons and substance or beings, how the Trinity evolved to be, maybe from early church fathers to ante-Nicene church fathers, then the Nicene church fathers, Cappadocian. We could talk about the divide between Eastern and Western Orthodoxies. But then there's also these sort of philosophical aspects where we probably need to go in further and speak about volitions. In other words, the ability to exercise a will as an autonomous person. We'll have to go further into being and person and things like this. But at the heart of the matter, Orthodox, classic Orthodox, what would be called maybe even Nicene Trinitarianism, this idea that God is three persons, fails because it fails to define clearly what the word person means. If it's not an autonomously willed person, modern Trinitarianism or social Trinitarianism fails, because even Orthodox Trinitarianism understands that if you have three autonomously willed persons, then who are equally powerful and equal in every way, then that's just clearly tritheism.